This image came up, and I apologize for its wobbliness. This image came up at the end of my scanning of my tetrahedron study folder, which I guess the video of I'll get to somewhere between tomorrow and never. But this is 3 pages I made, which more or less accidentally form a triptych. It's 3 8.5 by 11, more or less, pages, which is 3 silver ratio pages adjoined. Because that's what it took to work out the geometry as it corresponded to my understanding at the time of a tetrahedron as it quote-unquote relates to itself in more or less different forms of equilateral triangles from different perspectives. I'm not saying it's correct, but it was my attempt at a moment in time to approach correctness. And this comes into free will, destiny, the alpha and the omega. To put it bluntly or simply, when we study triangles and circles, we're studying tetrahedra and spheres, or a tetrahedron and a sphere. My tetrahedron folder full video, quote unquote, will speak to that more as far as the complexity involved with the simplest object in existence, a tetrahedron. The simplest object in 3 dimensions. Never mind how that relates to 4, 5, 6 dimensions. 4 points. The number 1. Those 4 points, that tetrahedron, can be considered the number 1. It can also be considered the number 0, as the quote-unquote Babylonian number system is base 60, even though there is no record of Babylon, and what we call Babylonian is supposedly Mesopotamian. But anyway, in a base 60 number system of quote-unquote Babylon, quote-unquote Mesopotamia, where 1 more or less equals the 60, how do we know that it was not the 0 that equaled the 59? Never mind, they're not like a true base 60 system because of the way they separate their base 60 into 5s and 9s, and how that relates to phi and the Eisensteinian omega. Anyway, free will. if we consider the divine ration of God as the lines and circle in this image, if we consider that quote-unquote destiny, and we consider everything in the background free will. Now, it's all related. It's all related. For me, life's pretty good. I experience terrors. But those terrors are not the terrors that spiders experience, vicious as they are. They are a frightened species, family. I don't know biology well enough to know what is the master group of spiders. But I know they're terrified, because as a house painter, I come upon them frequently. As our deer terrified, as our bear terrified, at least the ones I come upon. Beetles, for some reason, seem to be less terrified. Hoverflies appear to be less terrified. Bees appear to be less terrified. Hummingbirds appear to be less terrified. Doves are a little bit terrified. But when we look at the world outside of the comfort of even a terrified being such as myself, who is mostly psychologically or philosophically or existentially terrified, but I have it good. I make my dough. I have some credit cards that I haven't paid because I'm bad with money. And I'm greedy with the money that I have. So in that sense, as far as the narrative of what people should do, I'm pretty bad off. But in comparison to the Fangodidae wasps who murderously fight with little spiders, I have it pretty fucking good. Compared to the animals in the ocean, which viciously, perniciously, day in, day out, moment in, moment out, second by second, year by year, millennia by millennia, just eat each other. They just eat each other. So compared to them, despite my fecundatory bankruptcy. I've got it fucking awesome. You know. And in that sense, that's where fiat currency, which everybody derides, is actually an enormous accomplishment. Why? Because my bankruptcy is in comparison to numbers that don't exist. And those numbers that don't exist correspond to the numbers that do exist. And the nature of that correspondence protects me from the monetism of oceanism What is the monetism of oceanism? Eat you. Or you eat me. Oceans 10, 11, 12. Cloud Atlas. Anyway, even now as I look upon this image, I find it very complex. I don't understand it. But at the moment I drew it, it was in a moment of, I wouldn't say clarity, but it was a moment where I sought clarity, and I had enough clarity to seek clarity. I'm quite sure it's wrong, but it speaks to my and your seeking of clarity, clearness, rightness, truth, justice, all those good things. And it's a pursuit to understand the simplest object of three-dimensional existence, which doesn't even touch the simplest of our own existence, which is beyond three-dimensional, because we have motion, which requires at least 4 dimensions. Some people are into the 8-dimension thing, some people the 11, whatever. However many dimensions. I'm persuaded at this point to the 6th dimension. Though I do understand in some degree the way that the 8-dimensional and 6-dimensional relate to each other. And I've gone over that before with one of the objects I'm interested in that relates to the tetrahedron and the pyramid vacuity, though that leaves out the amplituhedral plex. So then free will. You know, they say most of the cosmos is composed of dark energy, dark matter, all that, you know. 90%, 93%, 97%, whatever. What is that? That's God's good dream. You know, there's some really great quote in one of the Harry Potter movies where the master wizard dude said something along the lines, just because you imagine it, or just because it happens in your imagination, or just because it's a story, something like that, doesn't mean it's not real. Simply put, the predatory aspect of the world, as it exists in us, in me, though I'm not as predatory as a shark, I'm not as predatory as many of the oceanic species, I'm not as predatory as many of the insect species, I'm predatory enough to understand predatoriness, especially sexually, but also in relation to that which I wish to put in my mouth. As food, not just sexually. But we can come to consider, so far as free will and sin is concerned, which is what, God necessitated to create the world such that, why did God create? God, in one sense, God created because God had an idea of beauty. But that beauty was associated with the idea, the concept of fright, fear, and awe. As the only thing in existence, as the only thing that is, as the only eternal thing, as the culmination, as the completeness, as the wholeness of all that is, wondered upon itself. From whence? From whence I came? What am I? Where did I come from? How beautiful and dark am I? Someone once said, God knows everything except for where God came from. If we accept that as our first proposition, then everything that came after is an attempt to answer that question. And that answer is either impossible, can't get to it, or it's the end of all questions. Either way, it creates the cosmos. I think it's pretty well generally accepted that God had to estrange God's self from God in order that God should know God, which creates that separation. So that's the whole idea of divinity, which is divided, which is double, dubitari, twin, but not a twin, if the doubleness, see, that's the thing, man. It's such a weird thing to comprehend. The cosmos, the universe, different concepts. But perfect incommensurability is two things that are unified. They rely upon each other. They're not opposites. They're one thing together that don't touch. Perfect incommensurability is the unity. Or at least, at the very least, is the, well, it's certainly the best analogy I can come to. And it might even be the truth. But perfect incommensurability plays at divinity, yet is unity. And it's a unity it's a zero-sum unity. Thus, it's a not. It's an N-A-U-G-H-T. It's an N-O-T. It's a K-N-O-T. It's all of those things. Tied up. Untied. So anyway, what is all that dark energy? What is all that dark matter? That's the I, the imagination. You know, Gauss had one thing right, even if his plane was Cartesian, which might not be right. It's partially right. The Gaussian plane is partially right. But it's kind of a small partiality, but an important one. But anyway, when he said that they ought not be called imaginary numbers but lateral. Well, on the one hand, that was a really nice thing to say, because it makes the imaginary number I seem less unimportant or less unreal. However, that was the wrong approach, in so much as the imagination, the I, imagination, the I, sight, I, the ego, I, the imaginary number, I, imaginary, I, magi, nary. The magical ego, the magical individual, the magical imagination. Why is the imagination magical? Because the imagination is the realm of the teleology. The imagination is the pull of the future. We imagine the push and not the pull. We imagine, what if we imagine gravity as the pull of the future? We imagine down with the bottom. What if down is the future? What if we're falling to the future? What if the great mass the entire cosmos falls to, right? Because when we're in outer space, there's no gravity. Just like when we're falling in a plane, there's no gravity. When we skydive shy of air resistance, there's no gravity. When we're in orbit, there's no gravity. But what if that's because the entire cosmos, the entire universe is falling towards a massive object, which is the future? And that falling is a pull. the teleological pull of the future. Whose power, whose energy comes from the push of that singular moment which may or may not have occurred. If there's an alpha, if there's an omega, and we consider as we can consider the triangle and the circle, and we consider the tetrahedron and the sphere, whose radii are 8/9 or 9/8 off, 9 pieces of 8. That ain't no joke. That's the truth. Because that has to do with planes as they relate to tetrahedra. And hemispheric planes as they relate to spheres. But we could consider the alpha as a tetrahedron, and we could consider the omega as a sphere. We commonly confuse pyramids with tetrahedra. So call it a pyramid, call it a tetrahedra. That's fine symbolically if you confuse the two. That's fine. Symbolically, more or less, that's fine. So whether we consider a pyramid or a tetrahedra, either way, verse a sphere. We could call it the tetramid. The tetramid versus the sphere. We could call the alpha the tetramid. That's the 50% of God that says it will be at least this much this way, which means this is the matrix in which we correspond. The other 50%, whether it's 49 and 51, however, but more or less half and half, which is free will, that's our choices. So the idea is to make that tetramid, the tetrahedron, the pyramid, the tetramid. The idea is to build that tetramid into a sphere. I've heard it said that, the tetrahedron is the inverse of a sphere. And I don't understand the exact math of it, but I understand the concept in so much as they are both the simplest objects in existence, and they're opposite each other. Because one is the sharpest and one is the softest. And they're both the simplest way to describe something that exists in 3 dimensions. So in a way of thinking, all that dark energy and all that dark matter and all that shit we don't know and don't see, is that part of the sphere? Is that part of imagination? Is that part of rationality that has not yet been enacted? That has not yet come to be? All that dark energy and all that dark matter is the choices that exist within free will that we have not made, and in some sense you could oppose dark energy and dark matter against each other, as we could oppose free will and sin against each other. In so much as perfection is to be found when we willingly, via our free will, choose to do the right things above the wrong things. And sometimes that line is gray. But, the knowledge, to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's that's an infinite statement that you could parse forever or for a very long time. And we confuse those things. Never mind eternity. So that's 3 different things. But ultimately what that means is there are certain lines we are not to cross. Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent says, oh no, go ahead. And that can be interpreted in 50 different ways. But the ultimate moral of that story is, and I'm going to boil it down to a very brutal, dark, easy to understand analogy. You don't murder your child. You have a child. It's a good child. You have a friend. You don't murder your friend. You have a parent that you love. You don't murder your parent. You don't slit their throat. You don't break their neck. You don't hammer their knee. There are things you don't do. Why? That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There are some things we're not meant to understand or know. What does that mean? It means we're not built. We're not made to understand. Like, it's not my job to know what it means to murder my sister. Right? Like, that is knowledge that I am not meant to know. Not because that hides something from me, but because it's incongruous and it's not perfectly incommensurate. Perfect incommensurability is not the same thing as incongruity. Murdering my sister, I don't have a sister, but had I a sister, murdering her would be incongruous. It doesn't fit with the entire structure of the cosmos. So I don't do it. That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that we are not meant to eat from. There are certain things we are not meant to understand. It's not my job to understand what it's like to saw my own leg off. It's not my job to understand what it's like, to cut your lips off. It's not my job to understand what it's like to be a serial killer for my own empowerment. Now, as a 0.00001% disclaimer, I will say the butterfly effect of God does at times require very strange things. but generally speaking, the dark energy, the dark matter, all that shit, is the eye, magic, the inner eye, that beauty you dream of. It's not just a dream. It is the truth of the future that is pulling us toward it. And if we don't seek that beauty, that inner beauty of the future, that inner beauty of the quote-unquote dark energy and dark matter, which is the light, we're in for a very bad ride. Anyway, that's just a small contemplation on a simple picture, which is confounding, even in its four-pointedness. The minimum, the smallest amount of points required for extension, required for existence in space even without time, never mind time. 4 points, a tetrahedron, the simplest object imaginable besides a point. And this is just a small contemplation upon that. Besides all that, I really, really hope you're having a good day. And if you're having a bad day, I hope you find a friend or a thought or an idea that rises you up. You wouldn't be here and you wouldn't be listening to this if your heart wasn't aligned with a love for the beauty of the one love. No matter how decrepit, murderous, or perverted you are, you wouldn't have made it this far had you not a supreme, beautiful love in your heart. And I know what it means to be alone and afraid and heaving. I've been there today. Anyway, hang in there. We only get there together. And remember, please remember above all else, that beauty in your mind that is more beautiful than the beauty that you see in life. You have seen beauties in your life that are grand and beautiful. From a subtle sweet wind to a grand torrent of color. To a grand torrent of orgasmic elation. Yet, in your mind, there is something even more beautiful. That is not just a fantasy. That is not a pipe dream. That is the pull of the future that will make a better tomorrow. But it's fucking hard. And you will not have rest till that future comes. which means he will work for a very long time, maybe lifetimes, to make that dream real and to kill God's bad dream, which God necessitated in order that God might know God's self. Period. Hope you're having a good day.